Weird orgies, wild parties, roots in hell. How did marijuana get such a bad rap? The answer is simple. Racism.
Our drug policy has really been traditionally based on racism and moralizing. The reason that the currently illegal drugs are illegal has nothing to do with the scientific evaluation of the relative risks and benefits.
You have to understand the war on drugs has never been about drugs.
Historically, anti-drug laws have always been associated with race.
But none of the drugs currently illegal became illegal before they were most closely associated with what were commonly regarded as deviant groups.
And it gets back to the scapegoat. So you can scapegoat different racial groups. You can scapegoat the lower classes. You can use the drug to do the scapegoating for you.
So if you ask how and why this distinction got made, what you realize when you look at the history is it has almost nothing to do with the relative risks of these drugs and almost everything to do with who used and who was perceived to use these drugs.
They were worried about all these Mexicans down on the Texas border who were, it was the depths of the Depression. And these Mexicans had been a very useful labor force in the 20s when we needed them, but now as the Depression, you got all these gringos in the bread line. You sure as hell don't need all these Mexicans. So how could we stigmatize them and get rid of this cheap labor force and get them out of here?
You know, saying that there's this drug that the Mexican migrant workers are smoking and it's loco weed and it's going to make them crazy and they're going to rape your women.
I think Harry Anslinger is probably the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. Harry Anslinger takes over the Department of Prohibition just as alcohol prohibition is ending in the late 20s. And Harry Anslinger inherits this really demotivated department that's really corrupt and has just failed in the war on alcohol completely, famously and catastrophically. And he wants to keep his department going beyond alcohol prohibition. And he's basically given responsibility for dealing with heroin and cocaine. But heroin and cocaine trades are really quite small in the United States at the time. They certainly wouldn't justify a government department that size. And Harry Anslinger decides to create effectively the modern war on drugs. He's the first person to use the phrase warfare against drugs, which I discovered when I went to spend some time in his archives. And he really he was extremely clever at thinking about how you manipulate American public opinion. And he decided if you want to have a popular war in the United States, you've got to build it around things that people hate. And he really constructed a story with the help of Hearst newspapers, which was the kind of Fox News of the day, that drugs were this thing that takes people over and they were being spread.
A relentless warfare against
Henry Anslinger, the United States' first drug czar. For him, public enemy number one, you guessed it, marijuana.
This guy saw how he could increase the budget of his department by having this mission, going after marijuana.
In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed. Part of the reason this act was passed was because of all the fear-mongering going on at the time.
Unfortunately, it seems like the word marijuana may have racist origins. Throughout the 19th century, Americans normally referred to their stash as cannabis. Companies like Bristol Myers Squibb and Eli Lilly sold cannabis medicines in pharmacies to treat insomnia, migraines, and rheumatism. From 1840 to 1900, U.S. scientific journals published tons of articles promoting medicinal cannabis. In fact, the only people who got high on cannabis for fun were wealthy people smoking hashish. But after the Mexican Revolution brought over 800,000 refugees to border states during 1910 to 1920, our country's relationship with cannabis began to change. The newly arrived Mexican peasants brought with them a healing mixture of smokable, non-cannabis herbs they called marijuana. In an effort to marginalize these migrants and to fuel anti-immigrant sentiment, politicians in California and Texas passed anti-drug laws that specifically used the Mexican term marijuana when referring to the cultivation of all opiates. After the Great Depression, the media was looking for a scapegoat for the country's misfortunes, so they blamed drugs. Conveniently, both cannabis and Mexican herbs were gaining popularity along the Gulf Coast in cities with African American and Latino populations. The media used the Spanish-sounding word combined with use by popular jazz musicians to pin white Americans' poverty on minorities. Newspapers ran shock stories and movies about dangerous murder weed that conflated the herbs with cannabis and labeled it marijuana.
Looking to find out more about the longer history of drugs in America, I found an unlikely source in Lincoln historian Richard Miller. His research put drug laws in a fascinating historical context.
Historically, anti-drug laws have always been associated with race. In the 1800s, certain kinds of drugs that are illicit today were common in this country. Cocaine was widely used, heroin. People using drugs was something that was just ordinarily accepted. Opium, for example, was used by middle-aged, successful whites, often housewives in the South. If people were addicted or abusing drugs, they were viewed sympathetically as people who had to be helped. It was seen as a public health issue rather than a crime issue. Well, one of the first changes was on the West Coast, when smoking opium was made a criminal offense. Now, why would opium smoking be illegal in California but not in Mississippi? What was going on in California that was a concern about smoking opium? Well, as it turns out, it had nothing to do with opium itself. The concern was with the people associated with smoking opium, and that was the Chinese who had come to this country, and many of whom were in California, working hard, working for very little pay, and becoming part of the American success story. But their success was taking jobs away from white workers. So politicians got together and decided they got to find something about the Chinese for which they can be criminalized to get them out of the way. Now, of course, you can't throw people in jail simply because they're Chinese, but you can throw them in jail because they smoke opium. In the same way, we saw things going on with cocaine. Again, it was middle-aged, successful people in this country, business executives, physicians, housewives, all perfectly legal. But then around the turn of the century, cocaine began being associated with blacks. They could withstand police bullets, it was thought. They can work hard all day, all night long, and all day long again, threatening the jobs of white workers. And so laws began to be passed against cocaine. You're not arresting these people officially because they're black. You're arresting them because they've committed some sort of drug violation. Next, of course, we see the change in reputation that hemp has had. Hemp was a legitimate crop from colonial times forward, a widely appreciated commercial product. But then in the 1930s, hemp changed into something vicious and fearsome called marijuana, because at that time, marijuana smoking was being associated with Mexicans, working hard, working cheap. And once again, what was being outlawed was not being Mexican, but just some habit associated with Mexicans. These laws set up a very dangerous precedent of racial control.
In 1937, Congress banned marijuana, and later, with Anslinger's help, they passed the first mandatory minimum sentencing laws, which made it so that your first time getting caught with this could put you away from 2 to 10 years.
Thank you, that's what I thought.
And the true irony is, the government knew Anslinger's claims were false. Scientists proved marijuana wasn't connected to violence or insanity in the 40s.
New York's prohibition-fighting mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, was somewhat skeptical of the government's claims that marijuana was causing murder, rape, and the destruction of America's youth. Wanting to get the facts, he commissioned a study by a group of 31 impartial scientists. After 6 years of medical and sociological research, the LaGuardia Commission found smoking marijuana did not lead to violent or antisocial behavior. Smoking marijuana did not cause uncontrollable sexual urges. Smoking marijuana did not alter a person's basic personality structure. Item by item, the Commission's report disproved every negative effect claimed by Harry Anslinger.
Despite this prohibition, however, the number of marijuana smokers kept growing, especially among the young. With the hippie revolution, towards the end of the 1960s, marijuana came into the open, and the joint became the symbol of social rebellion and an affirmation of individual rights. Confused, people wanted to know more. Faced with masses of youth who preached only peace and love, it was becoming more and more difficult to see the awful, bloodthirsty criminals described in the simple-minded propaganda of earlier decades. Many Hollywood stars also began to openly support the legalization of marijuana.
Have you smoked pot?
Oh, sure. 2 martinis will knock me flat. Pot, I just sort of sit around, you know. Imagine oh, it's a big subject. Of course, marijuana, in my opinion, should be legalized. First of all, you'd have wall-to-wall prisons if you really meant that everybody who smoked it had to go to jail. So, I mean, how can you possibly enforce the law, for God's sake?
Yeah.
You'd be trampling over bodies to get to the next cigarette.
This sudden wave of freedom deeply worried the right-wing conservatives.
I think this is the time and this is the place to take off the gloves and sock it to them.
In 1968, Richard Nixon ran and won on the promise of restoring tranquility and moral order in a country torn apart by social revolution. Among the first things he had to face was the large popular movement asking for the decriminalization of marijuana. To buy time, Nixon ordered a new commission to study the effects of marijuana on the individual.
I wonder if you could give us some of your thoughts on it.
Well, that's your point. As you know, there is a commission that is supposed to make recommendations to me about this subject.
But once again, the results were quite opposite to what he expected.
The recommendation of the Commission in its first report is that we do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
When Nixon was informed of the results, he trashed the report without even reading it. He then went on television to let the country know that the draconian laws on marijuana would not change.
I shall continue to oppose efforts to legalize marijuana.
DEA Administrative Judge Francis Young ordered a study on the therapeutic validity of marijuana and concluded that its placing in Schedule I was unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious.
He came up with a 60-odd page opinion saying marijuana is probably the safest drug in the pharmacopoeia, and it certainly has medical utility, and it should be moved to Schedule II.
At around the same time, England ordered a similar study by Baroness Wootton, a well-known sociologist and criminologist who had collaborated with the British government before. The results were similar to those of the Nixon Commission. The long-term consumption of cannabis in moderate doses, said the report, has no harmful effects. There is no evidence that this activity is causing violent crime or aggression, antisocial behavior, or is producing in otherwise normal people conditions of dependence or psychosis requiring medical treatment. The study concluded that possession of a small amount of cannabis should not normally be regarded as a serious crime to be punished by imprisonment. But there was nothing that could apparently change Nixon's mind.
I don't understand. If he knew it was safe, why would he be so tough on it?
Well, why don't you ask Nixon's aide, John Ehrlichman? He said in 1994,
we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
That's a real quote.
Yeah, that's a real quote. Nixon started the war on drugs to bully his political enemies and minorities. His own aide admitted it.
I can't believe I've been teaching this to children.
Look, we know for a fact that weed isn't dangerous, but we're still following racist old laws and throwing countless people of color in prison for no reason.